when you say JRPG, you have very specific things in mind on what that means, right? The way that it looks, the way the different, what type of adventure they're going to go on. It's not necessarily like set in stone, but traditionally you know what it means. And so if someone says they don't like JRPGs or they hate JRPGs, I can kind of understand that, being that we all can kind of have a general consensus on what that means. Now, maybe we are entering a new era where we have Japanese developers that are making RPGs that don't fit into that JRPG mold. And that makes sense to me, that maybe they wouldn't want to feel like they are associated with what our preconceived notions are. So I understand it, but I also I can understand feeling like you're put into a box by that term. But at the same time, it's like, well, this is kind of what we've come to know and expect from this definition. This is a tough one, and it's one that I feel like I need to spend more time listening than giving an opinion on, just because I'm not the person that can decide whether or not I would feel offended by this.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me that I have a problem with this actually is the source itself. And I'll present this to you, Chris, as we ask for your opinion. Eurogamer and others reported on this, and this comes from SkillUp, actually, who went and did a YouTube video when he was over in Japan and talked to Yoshi P. And it says, well, here's what Eurogamer says. In an interview with SkillUp and following previews of the game, Yoshida was asked about how JRPGs have advanced in comparison to action games. According to the interviewer, Yoshida was visibly uncomfortable with the phrase. And then here's what he said, quote, one thing Yoshida wants, and this was through Koji Fox, who's translating, quote, one thing Yoshida wants to get across is that when we create games, we don't go into them thinking we are creating JRPGs. We are just creating RPGs. The term JRPG is used by Western media rather than users and media in Japan. And then he goes on, this is going to depend on who you ask, but there was a time when this term first appeared 15 years ago. And for us as developers, the first time we heard it, it was like a discriminatory term, as though we were being made fun of for creating these games. And so for some developers, the term JRPG could be something that will maybe trigger bad feelings because of what it was in the past. It wasn't a compliment to a lot of developers in Japan. We understand that recently JRPG has better connotations and it's being used as a positive, but we still remember the time when it was being used as a negative. I remember seeing something 15 years ago, which was basically a definition of what a JRPG was versus a Western RPG. And it's kind of like Final Fantasy VII. And it has this type of graphics and this length of story, and compartmentalizing what we were creating into a JRPG box and taking offense to that, because that's not how we were going into creating. We were going into creating an RPG, but to be compartmentalized, that felt discriminatory. And he goes on, traveling around the world, speaking with fans and media about the image of the franchise, they would always give the same answer, that it's turn-based, that it's anime-like, these teenagers saving the world, very JRPG. This was the image for all Final Fantasy. This was turning off some players because they thought it could only be that and not a reason not to get into it. So he's going into a different direction here, but I want to say he's totally wrong about where the term comes from. And I actually saw Jeff Grubb, who's a journalist, write about this, where he's like, the term JRPG has steadily increased in use since 2008 and was in use well before that. And I agree. And he's talking about kind of the increase in use, but JRPG is a term, if not from the 80s, most certainly from the 90s, that was being used with rampant regard, beginning in the SNES era, certainly, but even in hindsight, talking about games like Dragon Warrior / Dragon Quest and other games we would get on there. So it doesn't come from 15 years ago. It comes from way longer ago than that. And what I think he's recalling is when the negative connotation began, which was about 15 years ago. And that was because there were a lot of really bad Japanese role-playing games coming out. Not JRPGs per se, but literally Japanese-made role-playing games. And it's why we call our upcoming game, that I don't know when it's going to come out, but the role-playing game we're working on is a Japanese style, or we're saying JSRPG. Because we all know what that inherently means. And I just I appreciate his cultural connection, which is far deeper and more intimate and more real than mine is to Japan. But we don't mean it as an insult.
I feel like he's in such a unique position to state his case because he has such a unique connection to the term and what it means and how it influences like development, or like how it influences the people, like, I guess, in charge of making these games. So I'm not in a position to necessarily like argue with him, but I don't agree that it's inherently a negative thing, or that it's just a descriptor. I do understand what he's saying, though, in the sense that you have JRPGs and then you have RPGs, and it's like, well, why aren't Why aren't JRPGs just RPGs?
Right. And this is
like that makes sense to me.
Well, this is
like
what
I hear that.
I saw someone comment on this on Twitter where they were saying something along the lines of the difference between a modern JRPG can typically not be very high quality, because he was saying, or she, I don't know who it was, why isn't Dark Souls a JRPG? Why isn't Bloodborne a JRPG? Or Elden Ring? Because they're Japanese role-playing games. I mean, they are literally Japanese role-playing games. And their argument, I think, is there is kind of this connotation that it's anime. This connotation that it's maybe kind of trash or cringy or whatever. And I get that, because that's probably accurate. But even when I say something, and I'm going to continue, I don't, Yoshi P is one man with one opinion. I'm going to continue to describe things as Japanese because we all know what that means. And sometimes, like, when you describe something as American, that can be really negative.
Yeah.
It could also be really positive. Totally depends. So when I say something is Japanese, we're going to have to talk about it from the connotation of what I mean it by. If it's just like I used the term a few weeks ago, even about Atomic Heart, Eurojank, right? Like that's we all know what that means. We're not insulting Europe, Eastern Europeans. It's just a term of art. It's just, it doesn't, I think that I get it, but I think he's thinking too much about it, because I do think he's ignoring that it actually is used complimentarily, and that the 15-year ago era he's talking about is the era of like hyperdimension Neptunia and shit like that. Like, I think you need to open your fucking eyes a little bit as to what was happening with Japanese role-playing games at the time to understand that the negative connotation wasn't because they were Japanese, but because they were bad. So Final Fantasy 16 is probably going to be a very Western style role-playing game out of Japan. And I don't think anyone's going to describe it as a JRPG, and maybe we'll have to. Do we need a better term? I think we need a better term for a lot of this stuff, but do we need a better term than Metroidvania? Yeah. We need a better term than Metroidvania. Yeah, I would say so.
It kind of goes back into the conversation about is Portal a first-person shooter? Yeah. But no, also, like, it's not at all it's not at all a first person shooter. If you really get down to like what a standard FPS is, it's not, but it literally also is.
Right.
So it's one of those situations where we don't have a particularly good lexicon for describing these things. And, that shortcoming or that shorthand is bound to either mislead or, maybe overgeneralize or maybe even mischaracterize certain things. Like Elden Ring is a Japanese role-playing game, but it's not a JRPG. Why? I don't know, but it just is.
Well, is it coming down to semantics where it's like, should we call Persona an anime RPG? Like ARPG, even though that means action RPG.
Yeah, you can use that as action RPG. That's already taken. But
right.
Here's my thing. If Final Fantasy 6 isn't a JRPG, what is it? I fucking dare you to tell me what Chrono Trigger is if it's not a JRPG. I dare you to tell me what that is, right? So it means something. It absolutely means something. And until we come up with a broader or more widely defined term to deal with all these things, we have to deal with the inelegant shit, where we have some things that make a lot of sense, like first-person shooter, but like Chris is saying, like, and I bring up Metroid Prime a lot, where this was a huge conversation at IGN. Is that actually a first-person shooter? I say yes. But a lot of people say no. And it's about perspective, and this is the tough thing about it. And when you're describing something as complicated as JRPG, there's so much more to it than what he's describing. It's not only aesthetic, but I think it's being in the menus. I think it's a certain level of equipment and statistical depth. Now, you could find those things in other things, but again, we know what we're talking about. But at some point, people are going to arrive on the scene that have no idea what you're talking about. And for those people, we're going to have a better way to describe it. And I often think about that with video games, how lucky we are, and especially people my brother's age and maybe even a little bit older, if they've remained attached to video games the whole time, have been playing them in real time the entire time. So there is no catching up, and you will never get to catch up. It'll not be like being in the movies. Like, there is going to be you will never catch up with video games. And so you're going to have a lexicon to describe things more readily. And I get that. I totally get it.